Hello world and welcome to the Tech Overflow podcast. As always, I'm Hannah Clayton-Langton.
And I'm Hugh Williams.
And we're the podcast that explains technical concepts to smart people. And today we're coming to you from London.
Yeah, here we are in the podcast room. It's so awesome. And it's very nice decor too. We'll have to post a couple of clips, Hannah.
Yeah, it's a lovely studio and it's always a treat to record in person rather than virtually, as I'm sure we've said a few times before.
Yeah, so true. Next series, I think we record the whole thing in person. We'll figure out how to do it.
Yeah, Hugh's making a pitch from Melbourne and I'm really open to it, to be honest, especially as we go into the UK winter. So share the podcast with your friends, and if we get to enough listens, then I will get myself down to Melbourne.
Fantastic. So I read, Hannah, that this month, which is October when we're recording it, is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month.
Yeah, so I read the same. I'm not sure what that means and which nation it's national to, but it's a good segue into the episode topic today, which is hacking.
Which is going to be fun.
It's super interesting, and I think it will pair really well if you've not listened to our episode on bugs and outages. I think there's like a really interesting common thread between these two topics because obviously being hacked is a massive P0 outage. So I suspect it ruins a software engineer's day in sort of a similar way.
Yeah. I think, search engine being down for 9 hours, whatever your favorite example is, definitely is tough going, but hacking is worse because you've kind of lost control. That makes it an extra level of stress.
And
sure.
There's blackmail involved.
Often.
Yeah.
Often. These hacks have become very, very sophisticated.
Yeah, there's like a whole subtopic I'd love for us to talk through on how AI makes this even more significant a threat. But let's start with the basics before we get into those.
Yeah, sounds good.
So, as listeners will remember from our episode on outages, 9 hours eBay search was down for.
Yep, felt like 90, but yep, that's
yeah,
right.
And that's probably like one of the worst days of your career.
Definitely.
Okay, so we're going to start the episode with a sort of case study. And in this case study, the retailer was affected for like 40-something days.
Yeah.
Okay, so this past summer, which is we're in 2025, famously in October, Cybersecurity Awareness Month, back earlier this year, there was like a spate of attacks on UK retailers. And there's a retailer called Marks and Spencer's who were basically the worst hit, and there's a lot we can take and learn from the case study. But if you're not familiar with Marks and Spencer's, as you may not be if you're an international listener, it's like I would call it a darling of the UK high street. So they have like a super well-regarded food business, and then they have a clothing and home business, which has had like a real comeback in the last few years, particularly for women in their 30s, such as I am. So they did some super clever things with acquisitions and rebranding, and like they're really, really much loved brand on the UK high street. Probably one of the key differences to bear in mind as we talk through this hack is that they are not an e-com pure play like eBay is. So whilst the fact that their online orders were down for over 40 days is pretty horrific, wouldn't have been their only revenue source.
And maybe for our US listeners, perhaps they're Nordstrom with an amazing food hall, and maybe a little bit like David Jones in Australia.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. So from a layperson's like customer perspective, suddenly the news is flashing headlines, M&S hack. Sorry, and I will use Marks and Spencer's and M&S very interchangeably in this episode, just to call that out.
Sure.
So Marks and Spencer's hack, this is huge. I understand that the first signs of a problem were that the tills or the like contactless checkout stops working in a bunch of the M&S. I think it was the food stores, but the stores in general, right? Contactless payment goes down. But pretty quickly, it emerges to be something much more significant.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I also have understood, and just to caveat, we've found a bunch of information on the internet about this, some of it from M&S themselves and some of it from sort of critics in the industry. But I think it's pretty widely known that the hackers came in via what we'll call social engineering, and they leveraged a couple of vulnerabilities in their processes. So there were hackers posing as employees. They pose as contractors, so they weren't pretending to be permanent employees. And I think that probably, if I'm a help desk operative and someone's calling asking for a password reset and they mention they're a contractor, that sort of immediately the story tracks in my head. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's fair. The other thing that was well known about these folks is that their English was excellent. They'd done this before. They were very, very good at persuading people like help desk employees to do the things that they wanted to do. So these are very accomplished people, very crafty, very good at pitching the right story in the right way to the right people.
And they ring the M&S help desk, which is also a third party, which I think that's not uncommon here, right?
Yeah, and that's important, Hannah. I mean, you are as weak as the weakest link. And so if one of your contractors or suppliers is a weak link, then that's usually the vector that folks are going to use to get into your systems.
That makes sense. If I were a hacker, which is something I think I'm going to say a lot in this episode, I'd probably be looking for stuff like that. And I don't think that means to say that by leveraging contractors or third parties, you inherently create a vulnerability. But I think if you don't set them up for success and integrate them correctly, then they could quite easily become one.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the hackers pose as these contractors. They call up the help desk. The people at the help desk are trying to help because that's their job. They reset their passwords, and these guys are in. They're in the systems.
Yep.
And from all accounts, so I think M&S issued some official communication that they caught this whole hack pretty early days, but I think that's been somewhat debunked.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. I think what is true is that once the ransomware was executed, and we'll talk about ransomware and what it does a little bit later on, once that was executed, M&S were very quick to explain that that's what happened and begin a path that took a long time towards rectification. But I don't think they were quick to detect that the hackers were inside their systems. And some folks are saying they're probably in there at least a couple of months.
We can talk later about whether or not that's unusual. I think the answer is no.
Not unusual.
No. Okay, so hackers, they get in, they exploit this vulnerability, and then they do like a few really key things that sort of set them up for success in taking things down.
Yeah, that's right. I think there's a couple of parts of the story that we'll never know the real details to, but what certainly happened is they got in as fairly low-level employees, right, or contractors. They've now got access to some system. It's certainly not going to be the absolute core of M&S, but they're in. They're in the edges. They've made it into some of the outbuildings, if you wanted to use an analogy. Somewhere along this track over the next couple of months, they've managed to what we call escalate their privileges. So they've managed to figure out how to get more access to, more of the buildings, to continue the analogy. Now, they might have done that in a couple of different ways. One way is perhaps repeating this thing that they've done. So they now perhaps know a little bit more. Perhaps they can do a little bit more social engineering.
So they're calling the help desk again.
Perhaps,
saying,
or calling somebody in the finance department or
Okay.
whatever it is, right? So at some point they're getting more and more access.
And I think that folks are trying to be helpful. Like, I work for a tech company, and if you need access to something,
yeah, I'm going to try and help. I'll share that spreadsheet with you as long as I believe you are who you are. And I guess because they're inside, they're able to do some research and probably build up a more credible story that they can then email about, talk about, whatever else it is. But slowly but surely over this period of time, they're escalating their privileges. They're getting more and more access.
And the way in which they infiltrated helped them do all this undetected, right? Because they've just got a normal employee login at this point. So you'd have to be pretty sophisticated in your monitoring to know that they're doing anything beyond what any normal employee would be doing, right? Like getting access to systems, logging in, having a look around.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I think the best of the best will certainly look for behaviours or patterns or unusual access by employees to unusual things and detect those. If you tried this out on one of the largest tech companies in the world, you'd probably get detected a little bit more quickly.
Okay, because they'd be like, why has the contractor got access to the Active Directory or something like that?
Yeah. Or why does this particular person change their login from a particular computer and come in as somebody else? Or who knows? But I would say, these patterns are, it's very difficult to do these things without getting detected if you're really, really working hard on the detection.
Okay, and we talked about this a little bit. I think it was in the product management episode when we were talking about like banks needing a certain level of security or user insight. And those are the kind of companies that are really going to be hot on like, why have you suddenly logged in from a location in
Nigeria
Africa
or whatever it is. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, this story, right? So they're escalating their privileges somehow. They're getting access to, again, sticking with our analogy, more and more buildings on the compound. At some point, they get access to what's called the Active Directory, and that is effectively the list of usernames and encrypted passwords. We can talk about encryption in a second, but encrypted passwords for everybody at M&S who can access any of the systems at M&S. And this is something that certainly should have been detected. They download this file.
Oh my God. Okay,
So
wait.
they take it out of M&S's system into their systems.
Okay, so Active Directory, I presume you normally would give like 3 people in the company access to.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, look, I'll tell you a quick story. When I was at Google Maps, I ran the whole of Google Maps, right? So I run the whole of product and engineering. I did not have access to user data, right?
Well, and why would you need that, right? If you think about your day job.
So you want as few people as possible to have access to that data, and even the person who runs it doesn't need access to it. So I couldn't go and look up, where you'd been in the world and how you'd moved around. I mean, just simply was not possible, despite the fact that I'm the person who leads the whole organization. So the best of the best will lock down access to critical pieces of the infrastructure as hard as they can possibly lock it down. But somehow they've got this file and they managed to take it off-site, and that should have been detected. And then again, like, some of this is speculation, right? We'll never hear the true story, but they've got this file. And then I imagine what's happened next is they've used what's called a brute force attack, and they've gone and tried to figure out the passwords of some of those usernames.
Okay, so you said that the Active Directory has encrypted passwords, which means that it's not hannah.clayton19 at whatever plus my password. The password is like coded in some way.
Yeah, that's right. And look, occasionally you'll hear of a company where passwords were stolen, and that's a company that's incompetent. So you should never, ever store passwords in their plain unencrypted form. So no company should have a representation of your password that's actually your password. So all companies should be storing an encrypted version of your password. And maybe simplest way to understand that, let's imagine that your password was an essay on a page, right? So you've got 500 words on a page. The encrypted version might be every 10th letter off that page saved as a string in the file. Now, that's not literally what's going to happen, because we're going to scramble it. We're going to spin the dials, if you like, in really interesting ways. But the encrypted version of your password is not the complete password. It's a sampling, if you like, of the password. So it's actually kind of one way, right? So if I only got every 10th letter off the page, I can't recreate the essay.
So I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole on encryption, although I am very interested in it. Marks and Spencer's or Google or wherever I'm logging in, they don't have my password written down anywhere. They have an encrypted version of it stored.
Correct.
Okay. They, however, do know how to recognize the correct password. Yeah,
because then, say, let's stick with this essay analogy. If you provide the whole essay, they can again go and take every 10th character and see if it matches what they've got saved on their system, right? So if you provide the full password, they can run it through the same algorithm to produce the same, what we call lossy version of the password, and then they can compare that sampling of the password to what they have stored. And they can say, oh yeah, great, this is actually Hannah because she's provided the same input to give us the same output.
Okay, and the encryption algorithm, it's like a standard rule that you put in for everyone.
So there's a bunch of different encryption algorithms, and some of them are easier to what we call crack than others. And maybe let's just talk about cracking for a second, right? You can pretty trivially, listeners might want to try it, but you can pretty trivially get lists on the internet of typical passwords. You can say, I want a list of common passwords, and you can download files that have probably got hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of very common passwords.
I suspect this is one of those moments where we don't realize as individuals how similar we all are. And so there's probably like quite a lot of overlap in the types of passwords people have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people use, dogs' names, their birth date, the word password, parts of their login name, the street they live in, these kinds of things. You're not original if you're having these ideas. And so you can get a file that contains a very large sample of all these typical ideas. And then, of course, what you could do is you could run each one of those passwords through the encryption algorithm that M&S is using and produce the password. And if the password matches what's saved in the Active Directory, then you say, bingo, the CEO's password is clearly this, because the encrypted version that you've created matches the encrypted version that's stored in the Active Directory. So if you've got enough time and enough energy and enough compute resources, you can keep running passwords through these algorithms and you can produce the encrypted password and get a match. And if you do that for long enough, then you can get the passwords of lots of people. So this is a very, very valuable asset to have, especially if you can take it offsite and do this kind of what we call brute force attack.
First of all, I'm going to ask you later why you know that you can buy passwords off of the internet. But do you think that's what happened? Do you think that the attackers in the Marks and Spencer's case figured out what the encryption algorithm was and therefore unencrypted all of the passwords.
Yeah, probably not all of them, but enough to give them some very serious access. So they probably at this point got admin access to the system, which effectively means, sticking with our building analogy, they can get into any part of the building they feel like and do anything they feel like doing. So they probably come in as a contractor, escalated enough to be able to get their hands on the Active Directory, taken the Active Directory away, spent some computing resources, and then come back with the admin password, admin login and admin password. Now they can do anything they like to M&S.
That is...
A couple of months of hard work.
Yeah. If you take out the context that it's crime, it sounds quite interesting, sort of intellectually, but obviously the impact of that for real customers and for the business is pretty catastrophic.
Yeah, I mean, terrible, terrible thing that happened to M&S and their shareholders, employees, the customers, everybody, right? This is a disastrous outcome.
Yeah, I think I saw that there was like £300 million worth of impact that someone had assessed. And they were like reverting to pen and paper to replicate some of the processes that were downed by the systems being out.
Yeah. And maybe that's a good time to pause and say, well, what did they do next, these hackers? So the hackers used this ransomware program called DragonForce. It's not important that it's called DragonForce. Good name. Nice name for a bit of ransomware. And basically what they did is they effectively detonated this thing inside of M&S. And what this did was it encrypted every single computer that they could possibly get to across M&S. So now your computer doesn't work anymore. It's effectively been turned into a giant password. Unless you know the password, you cannot use this piece of computing equipment. So they did this to as many computers as they could possibly get their hands on, roughly simultaneously. And so every computer effectively at M&S became locked.
That's the point that M&S say, we become aware of it and we immediately start managing it, which is true from the point of the ransomware deployment. But what was happening possibly up to 2 months prior, and sounds like what happens in a lot of cases with hacking, is these folks get in the back door through the window and then they set up all the different component parts of their plan, and then they hit the big button.
Yeah. And of course, I'll say it again, I'm speculating a little bit. I'm relying on what I've read, but this is a pretty common pattern, right? You get in as a low-level employee, work your way up, eventually get admin access, and then let rip.
It's really terrifying.
Yeah, it is. It is.
I think I read also, and I can talk about this from a customer perspective in a minute, but that whilst they were in there prepping, they stole a whole bunch of customer data as their like blackmail material. So they're thinking, in a situation where Marks and Spencer's can like revert the encryption and get back up and running really quickly, we also now have something to hold over their heads, I assume, to basically just like get some money out of them.
Yeah, I think they call it a double blackmail. We can now say, look, pay us and we'll restore your computers. And if you don't pay us or you do restore your computers, then we're going to release all of your users' data anyway.
So as a customer of Marks and Spencer's, I'm a big fan, by the way, of Marks and Spencer's, and was
Me too. Love them.
very disappointed that I couldn't order anything online for over a month. But I got an email saying that like some manner of my customer data had been like exposed, but that it wasn't payment data or like passwords. They were like, you may have read that this data has been stolen, and if it were, it's not like anything you need to worry about. That's my memory of the email. I tried to find it yesterday, but I think I've deleted it.
Yeah. This happened to my favourite airlines, Qantas. It's what I fly back and forward to London on. All of their frequent flyer data was stolen recently and actually released on the dark web because Qantas, I guess, didn't pay the ransom they needed to pay. And so all of my data's out there now, and my meal preferences, what seats I like to sit in, all those kinds of things.
Interesting, because my husband, just to talk about how common I think this stuff is at the minute, my husband's Eurostar account was like somehow hacked for the frequent flyer equivalent, like the points. And someone had then used his points to book like a free London to Paris journey. I guess it's like the same thing. Like someone goes in, finds something worthwhile, and they might be selling it to someone on the dark web who wants a cheap ticket to Paris or something like that.
Yep, exactly. I mean, this is it's a whole industry.
Okay, so they basically down the whole thing. M&S, I assume, M&S, let's be very clear, publicly state that they've never paid any ransom to the hackers. So on that basis, I can only assume that they rebuilt from the ground up over that 46 days, I think it was, that their online systems were down. And by the way, it's all back up and running. I go into M&S regularly to buy stuff. Contactless works. I've got an online order brewing. So like
Yeah.
For all intents and purposes,
They
as a
even
user.
told a story that, they brought forward a whole bunch of system upgrades and whatever else. And while they were down, they quickly went forward to the next version of their exciting new systems. Rather than take 2 years, it took them, no time at all because the systems were down, so they were fast to update. So they definitely spun this.
Isn't the inference there that the systems were overdue a massive update?
Yeah, you think so, yeah.
I need to be clear. This is all conjecture.
Yeah. And look, it's very hard to get to the bottom of these stories, right, for lots of very good reasons, both safety and legal reasons and also, reputational reasons. But, let's talk about why it took them 40 days, though.
Mm-hmm.
Let's imagine utopia, right? So let's imagine you and I work at the best run company in the world, and this happens to us. Mm-hmm. Bad luck, bad management, really sophisticated attackers. And imagine you're running the IT team. First thing I'm going to do, Hannah, is I'm going to go, so you can just restore from backups, right? You've been backing up all of our machines and all of our important software, and you've stored that, right? So can you just get those backups out of the cupboard and get all our machines up and running? How long is that going to take? And you're going to say, hours or a day or some fairly short amount of time. And that didn't happen here, right? So something's gone horribly wrong. If I were to speculate, I'd say it's one of two things. It's either the folks that hacked the system encrypted the backups or deleted the backups.
And that's because the backups weren't, I'm going to use your building analogy. In a world where this is a building, you want your backups off-site somewhere separate.
Yeah. Maybe you dig a moat around the building that you can't swim through with full of alligators. Exactly. Yeah, we call that air-gapped. So what we'd say is that the backups shouldn't be on the same network, shouldn't be connected to the main infrastructure, right? Because if they're connected, so if you've got a bridge across to the outbuilding, the thieves can just wander across the bridge and into the outbuilding and do things to your backups. Whereas if you don't have a bridge, you've got a moat full of crocodiles, you've very literally perhaps stored them on tape and put the tapes in a safe somewhere else, then there is no way these folks who've got into your systems can actually mess with your backups. So something's gone wrong here. Either the backups have been deleted or the machines that have the backups have also been encrypted in the same way as all their other machines.
Because there's not enough of a break in the circuit of systems.
Yeah, just simply not, you simply should not connect wherever your backups are stored to the network, right?
Yeah,
it should not be connected. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is more of a competence question, which is lots of companies, and I know some of our listeners are going to work at companies that are in this situation, lots of companies do backups, but they don't actually practice restoring the backups. So you think you're doing a great job of backing up, but it turns out when you go to restore them, you're like, we've never tried this before. We didn't back up something we needed to back up. We didn't back up a critical system. We backed up only some of the systems. Restoring it's really hard, doesn't work. So often competence gets you here.
Well, that's like my friend once gave me her spare key to water her plants while she was away for a month. And then when I went to her flat, the key didn't work properly because it hadn't been cut right. And she'd never used that key. Well, she'd gone and got it copied and then given it to me. But it sounds so obvious, but you think you've done the job by doing step one. But as you say, if you don't practice utilizing it, then you don't know how strong your backup.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. So something's gone horribly wrong here. Backups weren't able to be restored. And so I guess once they've realized this, they've gone, okay, there's no other way to get our systems back up and running except start from scratch. So we need to go machine by machine, re-image the machine, reinstall the operating system, get the software on there, get it running, test them, get them on the network, whatever else it is, and slowly but surely, work through every single computer that's affected at M&S to get the systems back up and running. And they've chosen for good or for bad at the same time to do some upgrades.
Okay, so that sounds like a really difficult 46 days for a lot of folks on the teams at Marks & Spencer's.
Yeah, I don't think it would have been a lot of sleep. I mean, what a terrible thing to happen to these folks. Look, there may be some questions of competence and detection and backups and whatever else. There's some processes that need improving, but what a terrible thing to happen to, an engineering team and a whole company.
100%. And I am sure that they are not the only company with these vulnerabilities. One of my global takeaways from prepping for this episode is this stuff's a lot of work, but at the same time I could see that if you're in a high growth phase or you're budget constrained, that your security engineers coming in and saying something needs to take a certain amount of time or requires a certain amount of investment will just immediately get squeezed and challenged because it's not sexy. It's not deploying cool new AI or product features. It's the plumbing behind the scenes that is probably pretty dense and complex to even explain to the executive team.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably goes in the same bucket as should we work on accessibility for people with vision impairment? You know, so say, oh, we'll do that later.
Yeah.
Yeah. And wrong choice. Wrong choice.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. And to round up the M&S story, the criminals were arrested, or at least some
Yep.
of them. So
Yep.
there was a group called Scattered Spider, or I think I read somewhere that it was like an offshoot of that group, but there's
Yep.
like these hacking groups and communities that exist. And like the craziest thing about this one was that they arrested 3 people in the UK, or sorry, 4, and they were all like between 17 and 20 years old.
Yeah. Which is probably, I mean, I don't think there's any mathematician who's invented anything interesting past the age of 30. So maybe one of our listeners will correct me on that, point out something. But yeah, no, it's definitely when your brain is perhaps best at these things is, teens into the 20s.
For me, it's not like their intellectual capacity to do this. It's their nefarious intent.
Yeah.
At that age, because this is a really serious crime.
Yeah, the folks are going to potentially get locked up for a really, really long time for this, right? Enormous damage. And let's be clear, these groups are not nice groups of people, right? They're up to all sorts of things. So these are dangerous individuals doing very unpleasant things, and there'll be consequences.
If anyone is feeling super nerdy, I sometimes listen to this podcast that I think is called Darknet Diaries.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, and it's like they interview hackers. They're mostly hackers that have sort of seen the light. But the way that the most recent episode, this guy, they don't reveal their identities, and I think they like being really candid and open about all their crimes. But it's really dark.
Yeah, it is. We should get somebody on the series 2.
Yeah, if anyone
keep promising things in series 2, maybe.
If anyone is a hacker, ethical or otherwise, and wants to talk to us, we would totally love to talk to you. Although I would say ethical hackers preferred, because I'm not sure like the moral argument around interviewing a hacker and them telling you about all their criminal intent and what you do with that as a podcast host.
No, we'll go the ethical white hat hacker on the show.
Yeah,
for sure.
Okay,
we need a series 2.
We need a series 2, guys. So
yeah, listen, share, subscribe.
Get me to
all
Melbourne.
Those good things. Get headed to Melbourne.
So this particular example felt relevant because it's quite recent. Like the arrests were made fairly recently. The hack itself happened in the last 6 months. And there's definitely some generic learnings that are interesting and insightful to talk to.
There's been a few in the news, Hannah. I was reading about one company called Colonial Pipeline. I don't know if you've bumped into those folks. They're a major oil and gas pipeline company in the US, and they had a ransomware attack, similar sort of story to the M&S story, and they were unable to, make fuel travel around in the east coast of the US, and it caused panic buying at gas stations. So, these attacks can be pretty serious. I mean, here in the UK, obviously it's affected the food supplies, but, this example in the US affected another piece of critical infrastructure. So, these things are pretty dangerous.
Yeah, I guess in the UK example, customers being worried about their data being exposed to me is probably the biggest concern, particularly with such a well-known, trusted, respected retailer. And this to me, and the Colonial Pipeline example, is just a reminder that like the hackers are going for vulnerabilities that they believe are valuable. Like in the UK a few years ago, they went after our National Health Service computers, which was like clearly hadn't been robustly invested in from like a cybersecurity perspective, or at least that is my conclusion from what happened. But like people couldn't have their surgeries done that day. So that's when it gets pretty dark. Like you're trying to disrupt the gas supply to folks during the winter. I don't know if that one was during the winter, but I assume it was a critical time. Yeah. That's where, we got to remember that there's some really intellectually interesting discussions, but like all in all, these people are nasty operators looking to create quite significant threats to like infrastructure and well-being of populations to
maximize the amount they get paid. So I think, the story on the street was that this Colonial Pipeline company paid $4.4 million to get this reversed by the hackers. So, they're going for critical infrastructure because they can hold these folks to ransom and get a lot of money.
Okay, so that M&S case study has actually turned out to be a super rich case study that's teased out like quite a lot of interesting insight already. I reckon we cut it here and come back next week to get into some more of the like technical aspects of hacking more generally.
I think that's a great idea, Hannah. I mean, there's so many more things to talk about, viruses, worms, Trojans, SQL injection attacks,
how passwords, people can be more secure.
How people be more secure, tips for companies. And I think the M&S story sets it up super, super well. So I think a second episode would be fabulous.
Okay, so that takes us to the end of part 1 on hacking, the anatomy of a hack. And we'll see you next week for part 2. If you've liked what you've listened to today, do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, give us a review, share with your friends, and you can find us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and X.
Yeah, and we're also available at techoverflowpodcast.com. And if you do like, subscribe and share this episode and our series, there's a fair chance that Hannah will get to Australia and there will be a second series.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you all next week.
Bye.
Bye.